Good afternoon, everybody. Scott Carson, founder and CEO of Powered by MRP and also host of Medtech Marketplace. Excited to share a couple of individuals with you and the mission that they're on with Portrait. Let me introduce Dr. Patrick Blake. He went to school at the Cleveland Clinic, went on to get his residency at UT Southwestern. But more importantly, he spent about a number of years in 10 to 12 different clinics, really honing his skills as a board-certified dermatologist in the clinical environment. And more to come in a minute on that. Also, we have Praveen with us. Praveen's an interesting guy too. He has a family, or part of a family, with over 20 clinicians, but he broke away from that group and went to school at Berkeley. And I've learned this in the last couple of minutes, MCB, molecular cell biology. He got a degree in that, also has a degree in ecom, but then went off and worked in private equity. And also some Fortune 10 companies, but then came back to healthcare because some of the things he saw. So gentlemen, thank you for joining Medtech Marketplace. Excited to have you, excited to dive into this a little bit. I've got a little bit of knowledge on Portrait, not a lot. But maybe Praveen, if you could just for a moment, tell us kind of why you started down this path and what Portrait's all about. And Dr. Blake, if maybe you could add some color and some commentary along the way, that would be great. And why the MRP listeners and the Medtech Marketplace listeners should care about this. What's the problem that you guys set out to solve, and how did you go about solving it?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump into that, Scott. So I think it's kind of almost easier to just, like, if you just understand the path of like how I ended up in the this position now where I've started this company with Patrick, Portrait. So as you mentioned, I come from a family of healthcare professionals, 20 in fact, and I think the experience of watching them, build their practices, their businesses in a variety of different ways, with different struggles. It's what I grew up around. It was dinner table talk. And I think it left a, very meaningful impact in how I view healthcare and how I view like access to like healthcare and what it means to like, be a clinician, and also what creates environments for clinicians to like thrive, and also what is a meaningful, patient experience. And so I think those ideas are always swirling in the back of my head because, it's just hard to go to, a family function and not have them complain about the various things that are going on in their, clinical setting and what bothered them and how it impacted their ability to deliver the care that they wanted to for their patients. So anyways, like that's just kind of like a baseline. As far as me, at Berkeley, I contemplated going to med school for a very long time myself, hence the, degree in molecular cell biology, but wasn't ready to pull the trigger, and ended up pursuing a degree in econ as well. And then I did, the thing that anybody who doesn't know exactly what they want to do coming out of college, I picked the most ambiguous profession, which was a management consultant. And, I worked across a lot of really big companies, a lot in just straight tech, but also some healthcare. And so it allowed me to like view similar problems, but from a much bigger scale with like some of those clients. So anyways, flash forward, doing a bit of like, private equity, very different field, energy. But I realized at some point that I'd done a lot of the things that were like interesting, in the sense, but not necessarily like inspiring to me. And I knew that I wanted to build something. And the knowledge base and I guess like personal resonances are always going to be in like healthcare. And I think that became like pretty apparent to me. And then ultimately the problem that really felt personal is, what does it take to survive as a healthcare entrepreneur today? And what it was like for my dad starting his practice, 30, 40 years ago is very different than what it is, when Patrick, was considering his various options coming out of like residency. And I think the core idea really behind Portrait is this, what does it take to launch a new generation of medical entrepreneurs? And, why do a lot of my very good friends from high school, college, who went to some of the best, med school residency programs, why do they choose to work at Kaiser? That wasn't true 20 years ago. And I think the reality is it's just the idea of going out on your own has been just squeezed away because the cost of operating is so expensive, the hassle of it, the risk of it, I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate for clinicians. I think it's unfortunate for patients. So anyways, that's a very long way of describing kind of like my origin story into this company. But hopefully it will give us some helpful context for this podcast.
I think it does. And actually, I'm going to just kind of bring something up that you touched on, but maybe to clarify how Portrait is, you're the CEO and the founder. How long has it been around?
So Patrick and I, we started this company in different space, more like a direct-to-consumer telehealth space in earnest, and that was actually in 2017. But Portrait, as we know it today, was really launched late 2019, early 2020, really basically right into the pandemic. So 3 years-ish, we've been running Portrait.
Got it. And I know you operate currently in 10 states, and we're going to talk more about what the kind of the overall problem is you're trying to solve in a minute, and then also how Portrait solves that. But maybe, Dr. Blake, if you could just talk a little bit how you two came together as co-founders and kind of where you fit in a similar background to Praveen, how he got involved and what this kind of led to, how you got involved in this, how you guys came together.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having us too. It's
you bet.
Great to be chatting. So I think Praveen and I both are unlikely to accept the status quo, I think, as individuals. That would be maybe an understatement. So when we were connected through a mutual friend, and at the time we were both really interested in, and I think we are still interested in, telehealth and kind of direct to consumer, direct to patient care, different care delivery models, and looking at ways getting way into into extremely hyper personalized medicine. That was kind of where we first connected. And in that process, I introduced Praveen to colleagues of mine who I think were particularly talented aesthetic nurses and physician assistants. And he also got a sense of the nature of aesthetics because, I was still am a practicing dermatologist. And really, I think we realized the tremendous amount of frustration that more elite type providers have, meaning that they have a lot of drive and they really care tremendously about their patient experience. They care tremendously about their reputation. So those are kind of characteristics you would find, in an entrepreneur, and probably not someone who's going to be thrilled working in a med spa where they don't have any kind of real say in how things go, how care is delivered. Their moment with the patient, but that's all they have. And so I think from those initial conversations, it was kind of like, this space of aesthetics is wonderful and it's exciting, but it also sometimes is not as professional as it could be. It doesn't necessarily, the rewards don't align with, where people are adding value. Kind of see that sometimes. So that was really it. Talking to those initial providers and getting a sense of their frustrations and thinking, okay, well, we're really interested in improving outcomes, improving care, improving provider experience, and we can probably do a lot better than what's out there.
But Dr. Blake, let's dive right in a little bit and tell me some of the barriers or some of the threats or pressures that clinicians are facing today as they kind of enter the space or currently in the space from a professional standpoint. Tell me kind of what the sense is of these clinicians that are out there operating.
Well, I think it is a really exciting field, aesthetics. I don't think there's anything more exciting, but the pace is blisteringly fast, and it is a hyper competitive field as well. I don't think there's been anything this fast or this competitive in really the history of medicine, to my knowledge. And so, what I have seen is providers who want to grow. They want to grow as clinicians. They also want to, get their own name out, get their own brand out, make deliver great results. But whether they're in a med spa where it's a single owner who has a specific idea about what care patients should have, or whether they're in a more chain med spa where, again, maybe things are very dogmatic, like this is how we treat patients here, or they're trying to do things on their own and they're grasping for a moment to breathe. If they're fortunate enough to have a busy practice with patients, to get the time to educate themselves, to continue to grow, to continue to, elevate what they can do for their patients. So I think, this isn't, there isn't a subspecialty or a specialty, board that you can go to get trained. You really do need to rely in part, at least, on pharmaceutical partners, on conferences, on mentorships, and all of that takes a lot of time. And so for a busy clinician, to continue to grow is challenging, and at a pace that you have to grow fast or you're going to get left in the dust in this field.
Got it. You guys made me think of something that's been bouncing around in my head, and I've had some conversations recently with a number of clinicians and the venture community that we're involved with. And think about this. Aesthetics right now is kind of in the first inning of its development. It's a relatively young industry. It's not really even 30 years old as you think about it. And, in comparison to healthcare, which has obviously been around forever, we're in the first inning of it. But there's a revolution occurring with private equity flooding into the space. And it's interesting. I thought it was fast a year ago. It's now pouring in. And I think, clinicians have continued to operate in the way, Dr. Blake, that you described. They could be high performing, but with tremendous inefficiency and lack of business acumen because they're focused on their clinical care. And they see private equity coming in, and they're intrigued and they're scared. But I don't think they realize, and this is the point I've been thinking about, how private equity and this kind of capital, when it comes in, the efficiency and competitive environment that it creates is unprecedented. We've seen it in the veterinary market, in the massage market, and the physical therapy market, just in clinical setting. And I could go on to many other businesses that have been rolled up through venture and equity. But you guys might want to talk about that, because I don't think people really understand, if they're a clinician, how competitive this is going to get in this space, given the intellectual capital and capital coming into the space.
Yeah, Scott, I think that's a great, very relevant topic. So look, there's plenty of examples of private equity coming in and trying to basically conduct a roll-up in different medical verticals. Some successful, some not. I think you brought up the veterinary space, which has, a generally good track record, but there are plenty of other medical verticals where this hasn't gone particularly well. And it's just a challenge, right? Because at the end of the day, you are trying to roll up a services-oriented business around people and their capacity to deliver care. And then you're trying to effectively trade up on a EBITDA multiple. And so it's still to be I think fair, it's still a hyper fragmented market. And kind of capital is actually being allocated into the space is still relatively small, and it's going to take a long time for these effectively micro PE deals to actually get to a stage that can then trade up into a larger roll-up play. The reality is it's just difficult to allocate capital into this industry. With that said, I think the signal that it has created amongst providers, and I think the point that you raised about just anxiety potentially it's real, because when you have larger players starting to emerge, they benefit from certain advantages that a smaller player may not have, and that creates a competitive pressure. And so when I think about Portrait, it's interesting. It's we're sometimes, I won't name specific names, but large funds have reached out to us and effectively told me hey, Praveen, Portrait is the perfect acquisition vehicle for this industry. And I'm you really don't understand what we're building when you say that comment, because what Portrait is really doing is taking the efficiency of a larger organization, instead of making it work for an equally large medical group, it's making it work for a single person, an individual who then gets to practice the way that they want, but knowing that they have, the technology and malpractice support and the compliance support and the, deals, with the larger pharma players in the space, which we know is very important. You're benefiting from all of that, and you get to focus on patient care, which is, delivering that phenomenal result, which is where your passion really lies. So I think, it's interesting to see how private equity is going to shake up the space. There's also just larger footprint, retail type MedSpas that are opening up and trying to expand their location footprint. So I think that's another source of competitive pressure. And I think we're just creating truly an alternative in the marketplace for somebody who wants to retain that sense of being an entrepreneur, but just wants, they want a fighting chance in order to operate in their model. And I think that's really what Portrait delivers on.
You brought up just something about the retail groups that are coming in, large franchise-based or large retail groups. But I think it's important to know it from your perspective, at least from mine, these are also private equity or VC backed. They've got enormous access to capital as well. And if they get any form of scale, they're even getting more capital. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also, there's a lot of different models, similar more franchise oriented, which is interesting when it comes to somebody who may have zero experience in healthcare, literally taking on a franchise and launching a business, to ones that are just consistent branding and vertically integrated and just owned. And there's many of those examples as well. Yeah, I mean, I think those are all relevant.
So I want to just take a minute and just kind of clarify everything and kind of reset the conversation a little bit for the listeners and the watchers. So basically, let's assume that I'm a clinician and I've been practicing for a number of years, or even if I want to get started, like so many clinicians are, jumping into this, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a physician, or maybe they're not even an esthetician. They just simply want to be a business owner. I realize I can go start on my own without really any knowledge or experience and kind of figure out as I go, which has really been the path historically. Or if I've been in practice, I could sell to private equity, or I could partner with some other people or sell some of my business. What all of those kind of traditional options that exist, what separates Portrait and what is it that Portrait's doing that would be interesting to me as a clinician? And again, all the listeners and watchers that are paying attention right now, what is that differentiating thing? What is it that you guys are doing that would be appealing to me?
Sure. So I'll answer that briefly, but I'd really think that Patrick can really probably give you a real depth of an answer here. I think the simplest way to think about it is you have all of these people who are creating a tremendous amount of value, right? They're the ones who are actually treating the patients. It is the time and energy that they have invested in their skill set. That vial, that syringe creates no value sitting on the shelf. You're not selling a product, you're selling an outcome, right? And it's a clinician with that product ultimately delivers that outcome. There's this dislocation. So how does somebody who's creating that value actually get to realize that value for themselves? And there's all these reasons that's difficult. All these stumbling blocks. So, the idea of, wanting to go out on your own, I think that is a very captivating idea, but the reality of it is pretty messy. And Patrick, I mean, I feel like you can really explain this best as a clinician.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I'll try to get through it. Give me about 3 hours here. So I think
we got plenty of time.
Yeah. So again, providers, I think clinicians have an awful lot of opinions. We have a lot of convictions about how we want to deliver care and what good care is, and what we want for our patients, how we want our days to go. But it's also a world of, fixed time and fixed resources. And so I think if you, talking to a lot of, I think, and I'll focus even on, I'd say whether it's physicians, NP, PA, RN, clinicians, basically the story is kind of similar, that I think a lot of times people stay in situations where they are, they're happy with their role as a clinician doing what they want to do, but they don't want to go out and do, quote unquote, their own thing, because that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. It's a huge distraction. I mean, that's the reality. If you love clinical care, you kind of have to give up a lot of it. You give up seeing patients, you give up your time, you give up your flexibility to go attend meetings or to learn, because you're trying to run a business. And the flip side, I think, even when people do get into that phase and they have run a business for a year or 2 or 3 years, there's still a lot of, kind of to what you're alluding to, Scott, there's a lot of inefficiencies in that system, in that individual's practice. And so what we find is that providers are able to, who decide to work with us, they're able to maintain all of their own individuality, their own presence with their patients. They can, create their own brand and all the creative, really the fun parts of having your own business, I think, but they're not trying to source an EHR. They're not trying to figure out, am I going to have enough money to get through the next month? I'm not, they're not looking for funding. They're not going to walk themselves into bad regulatory situations, which we've seen, time and time again. They're not looking to hire staff and have to deal with HR issues. So kind of all of the headaches of the running a business, we really try to remove just about all of those. It's not, we're not perfect for sure, but we really do deliver like a business in a box, and it's your box, though. You can make it how you want it. And so I think for a lot of clinicians, that's really attractive.
So just maybe give me an example of, sounds like, and I've got a few questions here. It sounds like you would work with a nurse practitioner, you work with a physician. Tell me the scope of clinicians and practitioners that you work with. Give me that kind of landscape a little bit, because I think you got a lot of people intrigued a little bit in kind of what you're doing. We're not really clear yet, but maybe start with who is your target partner that you're looking to work with?
Yeah, so we work with experienced NPs, PAs, and RNs. We would actually be very interested in working with physicians in the same vein. I think the same way we kind of structure things now, and really the reason in large part is we're still a young company, so I think over time we're probably going to work with providers who are maybe not even as experienced, because we do a tremendous amount of training. We do a lot of mentorship. We do a lot of professional growth. And so we would potentially bring on, more junior folks in the future. But, again, we're a reputation-oriented company. We're an outcomes-oriented company. So we would need to make sure that if we were bringing on someone a little bit less experienced, that we got them to the level where we know Portrait is going to be a really great, consistent patient outcome.
Okay, so if I'm a nurse practitioner or a PA or a physician or a registered nurse, any of that in those groups, I'm currently a potential partner for the Portrait relationship. Is that a fair statement at this point? Potentially, if you're beyond that. But if I'm any form of registered clinician or licensed clinician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, registered nurse physician, you guys partner. I just want to make sure I got that foundation correct.
Yeah, and maybe I could just give you a bit more context there. Depending on your licensure, you're going to need different types of support, and it's also going to vary by state, right? Yeah. But the core idea of, do you want to effectively launch your own business? We could service all four of those providers based on their licensure, right? Yeah. And the reality is, it's it's not something that we've really gone deeply into, but there are some very notable physicians that we have spoken to or are currently talking to, people that are fairly just eponymous in the industry of aesthetics, who find our business model very interesting, attractive, because it allows them to kind of focus on the things that they want to do, in the same way that an NP maybe feels a bit trapped, or an RN who feels a bit trapped in the current situation, also just wants to focus on the thing that they want to do, and so obviously, an RN being unable to actually go out and purchase, medical supplies, faces different challenges than maybe a physician, but the challenges of overall being successful in a business might be more similar than you realize, and so I think once you start to view it through that lens, I think, the overall idea here is that we are promoting entrepreneurship across aesthetics, regardless of your licensure, but again, with a keen eye around making sure that patient safety is always number one. Patient outcomes are always in focus, because we know in this industry things can go a bit sideways, and the truth is most people don't even realize the risk exposure that they have, which is the unfortunate thing. And it's also one of the challenges of operating as a solo provider, because it's quite frankly impossible for you to keep up to date with all of that, and it's a lot more than reading an MSpa guide or something like that, and thinking that you've got it all buttoned up. I guess maybe to touch on that in one layer deeper, it's always interesting to me when you talk to the most senior people in this industry and the humility with which they approach their role. because it's like they kind of reach a point, they're like, wow, there's so much I still don't know, and then there's people that are much earlier stage in their career and they think they know everything because maybe they haven't gotten burned yet. And that's probably the nature of like most things, I guess. But a lot of the providers that we work with, they are very, very skilled injectors, often trainers, often national trainers. And so I think the idea of like focusing on that kind of talent is, in a way, like it's also the people that they probably deserve this opportunity the most right now, because they've really worked towards it, and we want to, obviously supply it to them. But to Patrick's point, the idea of being able to promote entrepreneurship and scale providers launching their own businesses at all stages of their career is ultimately where we want to end up.
There's a bunch of stuff I want to touch on here. As you guys know, at MRP, our customers are individual practitioners. They're entrepreneurs. They're private equity-backed derm organizations. They're plastic surgery groups. I mean, they're all sides. And what I've realized over the years of building MRP is there's the right relationship in all of these environments. Meaning, there's clinicians that I just have a good customer in Texas. He's actually a dermatologist, but doesn't practice dermatology. He has 6 clinics. He has a lot of derms that work for him, mostly derms actually, and they're all incredibly happy because it's the right place for them to be. It's the right place for him to be. It really works. So there's all different types of models, but I think what I want to kind of get everybody to understand is kind of what you guys are doing is I'm kind of unwrapping this and getting my head around it as everybody listening is if I'm one of those categories we talked about, a physician, nurse practitioner, PA, or a registered nurse, and I don't think private equity is the right place for me to go, meaning I'm not in a position where I can sell my practice, or I don't want to go to work for them and start a practice and be locked into a long-term relationship, or I don't want to sell my business to a franchise, or all of those things don't really seem appealing to me, but I want to grow or I want to start. It sounds like you guys come in with Dr. Blake's incredible clinical experience, tremendous education. Praveen, they come in with your incredible background and family history, your intellectual fortitude. You kind of bring that together and you help them basically become a very competitive, best-in-class, best provider business and take away a lot of the risk profile associated with making that leap. Do I understand that kind of right?
Yeah, I think you do. I think, again, like Patrick can probably speak to this more deeply as a clinician, but maybe like one bigger idea here is aesthetics is unique in the way, the pace of how quickly it evolves, right? It's not stunted by like massive institutions or like contracts with like, payers. It just evolves like very rapidly, right? And to stay at the bleeding edge of that, in terms of, what the most relevant treatments are, what patients like might be seeking, just competitive market forces, it can be very distracting from the actual work at hand of just being a clinician delivering like a good outcome. And so I think it's not only just the idea of getting up and running and going, it's the idea of just continuing to thrive in this industry. Patrick, I don't know if what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's, again, you can only be an expert in so many things, right? And I think for clinicians, this aesthetics is a thrilling but competitive field. And the fact that it does change so quickly, it really requires your full attention to do well in this space. And yeah, we've we have a wonderful team, and we've put an awful lot of thought and made a lot of iterations too, thousands of iterations to get to a place where I feel really great about the experience, the day-to-day, provider experience that we can provide.
Yeah, I don't think people, clinicians, understand is they're operating, even if they've had a significant amount of experience, understand the risk profile that they're operating in. Your risk profile with one adverse event can change on a dime, and your legal exposure can change. And what you talk about iteration, Dr. Blake, what I've noticed is the regulatory environment alone is changing by the moment, on a federal, on a state, on a county, on a city level, by device, by licensure, by non-licensure. I mean, I recently, in a podcast I did a few weeks ago, heard that Oklahoma is now allowing hygienists to do injections. I mean, the regulatory environment is just completely upside down in every possible way. I mean, when you guys are smiling, you think about that, how I want to be careful what I say, but I think we're all thinking the same thing. Is it just, that's a Wild West kind of idea, but it's also going the other way from a regulatory environment. And I think it's really difficult to keep up on that. This is also a business, as we've touched on, that's so competitive. And I think it's picking up speed. Maybe you guys touched on that. I actually think it's getting faster, incredibly fast, almost like a turbocharger on it. The market's getting bigger, the capital's getting bigger, the patients are getting younger. It used to be a female-dominated market when it came to who was getting care and procedures. Now it's the male market is exploding, the young male market's exploding. This is becoming an unbelievable kind of land grab of opportunity. And with that comes all the regulatory changes that are so difficult to keep up on. So I think I've got a good idea of Portrait. I think the listeners and watchers do. What might be interesting, I think, is spend a little time with you guys, kind of understanding the model prior to getting on this call. But I think it'd be important as we took some notes and talked about things, and we touched on a little bit, maybe talk about some examples of where you guys have come in and solved some problems. And one of those things is not the appropriate kind of oversight, management oversight, regulatory oversight. Maybe talk a little bit about something you've seen that would be relevant and how you guys kind of solved that and mitigated the issue and then got back to treating patients.
First, I'd say there are, maybe stepping back, there are unfortunately a lot of situations also where we have wanted to work with a provider and we really couldn't because they already had incurred, an active investigation or issue with their license. And that is, I would say all of those situations that we have encountered would be were completely preventable and not done through any act of, malice or, gross unprofessionalism, just people not knowing things that they should have known. And I think because the standards are different and you don't have a single governing body or, a board that issues like a specialty board that issues recommendations, there's an awful lot of judgment calls. And so situations where, for instance, provider who super diligent, doing everything she could, she thought the right way, incredibly knowledgeable, and ended up having, did not have formal standardized policies and procedures that were specific to her practice. And she got an investigation that was initiated not through a patient, but through someone, I believe it was a former spouse or, something like that, but a personal connection that launched this and got an investigation going. And she was, she's still in a holding pattern with her license right now. I think for the people that we've worked with, it's interesting where how many of them will say, hey, I didn't know about this, or why do you do it this way? And we'll say, well, you have to have, this is really what we think is requisite for, say, something like a good faith exam. This is dependent on if you've read the laws in these different states and you've read the cases on how these different boards handled X or Y bad outcome, which we have done. So you can kind of get a much deeper, broader picture to what is appropriate oversight. And so there are a lot of providers who come on where they say, well, I never have had, my doc never, co-signed my notes or something in this. And I thought that, it's not absolutely necessary by law. And it's well, in some states it's not necessary by law, but you need to have some system that's showing that you have appropriate oversight. You want, you kind of want to build your levees high enough that if the water rises a foot, it's not going to spill over. And I think sometimes in some practices, people have kind of just done enough to get there. And the reality is, if you run into any kind of upset patient for any kind of reason, it's much easier to be able to present a really clear, coherent package of this is how we operate, and you will make everybody feel good. Regulators will feel good. Yeah, the patients actually feel good too. I mean, we have occasionally a patient who is unhappy, and we show them everything that we're doing to, put them in the best position and providers in the best position, and those conversations go really well.
I was just comment on something, Praveen, if I can, just quickly, is just from my experience. And Dr. Blake, that a lot of clinicians reach out to me for help on all kinds of situations, bad manufacturer behavior, adverse events, legal issues. And I don't think clinicians understand that most legal issues, whether it's with licensure or lawsuits or some regulatory body, starts with somebody pulling a very simple thread. It could be a spouse, could be an employee, could be a patient. It's relatively benign, whatever that issue is. And the initial thought is, hey, this isn't a big deal, I didn't do it. But when the legal environment starts pulling on that thread, it quickly turns into a rope of mistakes that weren't made, or omissions, or processes that weren't followed. And then the thing starts to get momentum because you start to see all the things that weren't done correctly. And now this has become part of public record. It's now documented. Now the suit gets momentum, or the licensure claim gets bigger. And now it's out of control. Now it's like a fireball rolling downhill, and it's almost unstoppable. And I just don't think clinicians understand it's those moats that you're trying to build when those threads get pulled, that when something happens, they get stopped. You've got that line of defense where you've got your note signed, so nobody can pull any further on that thread. Sorry, Praveen, I just wanted to touch on that usually when somebody calls me, the problem isn't the first thing. It's the thing that they've uncovered through the 90 days of discovery that has taken place that really has put the clinician in a very bad position.
I think that's a really good point. And what I was actually going to do is actually to kick the conversation. Like, I think we're operating at like a certain altitude. If we could operate like at a slightly higher altitude, we're like two buckets, right? Like, we're talking a lot about compliance and regulatory, and I don't want this to be like to scare the audience out there. There's really just like two buckets. There's known risk, and then there's like hidden risk, right? Like, a known risk is like, did I negotiate my lease correctly? Or I know that like sometimes like providers who launch their own practices will buy too much product and not have enough patient demand, and so then at the end of the month, it's like my bank balance is going to go negative. And that's like the first time that's like happened to me. And then I realized like, oh, cool. Like, I need enough of a buffer in order to like actually ride this out, right? Those are like more like known risk. And then there's like unknown risk, which, I'm building my practice or business, and, I'm like, trying to focus on treating patients. And then all of a sudden I realize I have to do all this other stuff, but I thought I was done. And now it becomes like a distraction. And now I'm focusing on that too. And meanwhile, like, my practice is like suffering as a result of that. And so the period of like ramping and just getting to a place where like you're successful, all of a sudden becomes like much longer. And what we know is the longer it takes to get to that point, the less likely you are to be like successful overall. Especially if you're someone who is like trying to like, really, build on the like relationships that you have, with people that you've treated in the past, because the longer they go without actually seeing you again, because you're struggling to get your business operational, just the lower overall probability of you being successful with your new practice, because it is a competitive like marketplace. So there's just like a lot of ways for people to get like tripped up in this industry. And certainly like, the medical regulatory compliance is a huge one. And it's one that we spend a lot of time on. And our model is like pretty battle tested at this point, but there's also other ways in which people get like really tripped up, And so it's like, I give you like one specific example of like, maybe they get ahead of their skis and in terms of like how many purchases that they actually make, and realizing they actually don't have a personal bank balance to support it. But they also did that because they needed to get better pricing, because otherwise they'd have to charge too much for each treatment, But that's like a classic.
Yeah, that's a typical problem of a solo provider is they have no aggregated buying power. They have no aggregated leverage in any way. And because of that, they make bad decisions because bad decisions when it comes to a longer term because they needed to solve a short-term issue. And so I think what you're leaning into a little bit is this is where your kind of aggregation of your clinical group has some buying leverage, buying power, aggregation power. Is that what you're touching on?
Yeah. I mean, it's things like that. It's also just getting, support from, whether it's like a patient care coordinator or like somebody in office and, not having like a big enough practice to actually make that investment yet. Right. Whereas like, that's something that we can like front load for people. So there's just like a lot of things that we do to put people in a position to be like successful right out of the gate. And again, like, Dr. Blake, maybe you can like dig into that a little bit more.
Let me dive into that a little bit because you reminded me of a conversation that I had day before yesterday with interestingly, she was a trainer for a major manufacturer, a nurse. And she said, you know what, I've been selling and training into the space for a decade. I want to go break out on my own and become a practitioner. Her and her husband kind of got together, put all the capital they could together, spent some time kind of buying the right products, made some bad decisions. And when I was talking to her the other day, she goes, Scott, this is so hard. It's so difficult. I've made this huge investment and I don't have any patience. It sounds to me like that's a great potential partner of yours.
Let's talk. Yeah. I mean, I think, in all seriousness, we have encountered that a couple of times with providers who had started their own business and were basically in really bad lease arrangements, or, we're just not finding enough time. And also it's not just business, not finding time with their family. That has definitely come up where they're like, I feel like my kid is growing up on me and I'm not seeing them. So, all of that stuff, it really, everybody has areas of expertise. As a provider, like I wouldn't, it drives us crazy when you've got a patient who comes in and tells you this is how it should be and this is what treatment I need and those kind of things. And it's the same way. Yeah, I think we should also realize that we're not experts on everything, and we also, spend your time doing what you enjoy.
So I just want to make sure. So in this particular case, she's got the foundation in place. What she's really lacking is patience. She probably also lacks, based on what we're talking about, a certain amount of maybe what she doesn't know, the bucket that's the unknown, Praveen, as you mentioned. But is she potentially a partner of yours? I want to make sure if I understand correctly. Is she somebody that could come into your network and you could help her basically get more patients, market more effectively, create efficiency in her practice? Is that a potential client? Because I think you've got people out there right now, there are probably thousands of them in her situation, and they're like, should I call or not call?
Yeah. So like, I'll say that, I think about it kind of like a Venn diagram, right? There's like two requisite like ingredients, I think, to be like really successful in the portrait model. The first one is like, are you a skilled clinician who delivers like great outcomes, right? And so, just given the nature of our model, and certainly like we might go to, in the future, like start to work with people that are like newer to the space. But like right now, we typically focus on somebody who has like 5+ years, experience, just from terms of like patient safety and just like delivering like great outcomes. Doesn't mean that there's like it's actually like that population is constantly looking for like more training because they realize how quickly the space is evolving. But that's typically the type of provider that we work with. And so that's ingredient one. Ingredient two is there is a core truth around like, patient relationships. Like, you've been in the industry, you have like a base, doesn't have to be like massive, but it's a lot easier to build off of like that base, to build a practice rather than like starting truly from scratch. And so that's just like, we're partners with them in this. And so if you just don't have enough patience, from the get-go, you can throw all the marketing at it, but it's just going to be like a long road and it's going to be like discouraging for a lot of people. So like we're accelerant, but like you need to have that core truth.
So let me, this actually goes to one of the questions I was going to ask. So I recently, MRP sold a piece of equipment to somebody she was a PA in a large derm clinic, and decided the derm clinic got acquired by private equity, and she had no part of that acquisition. She was a PA and she wanted to go out on her own. And man, it was, what a process for her. And she interestingly had access to capital, but sounds like she had, in this case, she had a massive patient following, but really didn't know the first thing about going out and building a business in a highly competitive market. Sounds like she is the perfect candidate for you.
Yeah, she would have been.
Okay, got it. Okay. So you would then come in and basically provide, given that you're a VC-backed organization, I think I understand that correctly, you would come in, provide the oversight, the capital, negotiate the leases, put this clinician in the best possible position to thrive and really focus on great clinical care and not all the back end stuff that really drags down that great clinical care, because she's been able to operate like that in this environment where she has nothing to worry about but coming in and execute and really hone and accelerate her skill set. But now she's out on her own and she's a business owner, and all of that time and energy is now going into business owner. You're going to take a lot of that away.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way of thinking about it. I think another useful framework is it's almost like you're like fast forwarding time, So like if somebody were to launch and if they did everything correctly, their very best outcome would probably still be worse than being with Portrait, for like structural reasons. Maybe they just didn't have enough purchasing power, or they weren't able to like split support across like multiple providers, and so like they would have to bring on somebody full time into their office as a single provider, which would really eat into their take home pay. So it's I think what's interesting to me is like when we talk to people who've actually gone out and done it on their own, and then they realize that they're like, wow, like I actually still don't do as well as your providers, and I've put in 2, 3, 4 years of work on this thing and made a whole series of mistakes, which was totally understandable given you're just trying to figure it out on your own. And they still like the end result still isn't as good. But a lot of people, it's like it's hard for people to like see that when they're in the middle of it too.
I want to comment on that. You said something, Praveen, a moment ago about we want to keep this a little lighter than kind of the doomsday of what happens in some of these situations. But one of the things that I'm well known for is talking about failure, personal failure. I talk a lot about the failure that we work in. Is I don't, and the reason why I spend so much time talking about it is this is an industry which the entire industry is stakeholder. When I talk about it, the industry, not clinicians, the industry that serves clinicians or supposed to serve clinicians, is all stakeholder and shareholder focused. They're centric on stakeholder and shareholders. What I mean by that is, if you look at some of the biggest publicly traded companies in aesthetics that are supposed to be serving you guys as clinicians, they are solely focused on sales and marketing incentives, sales leadership incentives in the C-suite and the shareholders. If you look at the capital that they're aggregating on their balance sheet and the margins they're maintaining, some of these companies are operating at margins that are greater than software companies, which is impossible to have margins at 80 to 90% in capital medical equipment aesthetics. That should be illegal. It's so outrageous that you guys are paying for. And what I'm getting at is you have this industry that's just completely fighting against you. And what it does is it sets clinicians up for an unusually or disproportionate amount of failure. And one thing I share with people every day is there's 1,200 used devices in our building. Every single one of them came from failure. They bought the wrong thing, were bullied into buying something, bought a device that doesn't work for their color, their patient population. There's just so many things that can go wrong. And that 1,200 is right. We have tens of thousands of items for sale in our database we haven't bought yet. There is so much surplus of gear alone that people have bought, and they're paying for this in debt at their bank and high interest leases, which sets them up to unbelievable failure profiles. And I think it's disproportionate than a typical entrepreneur that starts where their failure rate's high. It's outrageously high in aesthetics because of this predatory market that exists. You can't come up with another market where sales reps knock on your door. Now I'm hearing sales reps are setting appointments as patients to get in to see clinicians. They're paying patients now, paying for the consult, paying for the treatment so they can pitch their products because clinicians are putting up these moats and keeping them in. You can't find an industry any in the world where it behaves like that. And I just think it sets people up for an unusual amount of failure. And if I'm hearing you right, you're creating that moat that stops that.
Look, there is a lot of failure in this industry, and it doesn't get a lot of light because it's probably not a very fun topic, and certainly not one that, a lot of vendors want to speak to, especially when they're trying to sell into the market. And you certainly realize it when you get an understanding of how many accounts, some of these larger suppliers have, but how small most of them are, and where most of the money is made is basically just like a very small sampling of that population, that practice population, basically like a very long tail type business. So I totally hear that. But there also are like a lot of really incredible like success stories. And I think,
let's talk about that. Let's talk about smashing into ceilings a little bit. Let's talk about the great growth opportunities that exist. I think it's important to set the foundation of why it's so difficult as a clinician to break into the space and what the risk profile is. But let's talk about the success.
Yeah, it's been incredible to see like how some of our providers have like launched, and it's really just been like life altering for them. Like if you go to our Instagram feed, you'll see some of their testimonials, but it's not just the pay, which obviously is like, for some of them has been like 3 times what they've made in the past, which is just like, they're like, wow, I think they're both blown away by that, but also just like, wow, like I was creating this much value and I didn't really get much of that value for like the majority of my career until I joined Portrait. So yeah, there's I think that's just the rewarding, fun part of doing what we do. It's probably the part that I think personally gives me and Dr. Blake the most energy. But yeah, Patrick, I don't know what your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think we get a lot of wonderful messages from providers when it's something like, they're taking a month vacation. They've never taken a month vacation, or they're buying a house, or, they're spending more time traveling with their family. Or I get a lot of ones of just new outcomes, not new outcomes, but new procedure outcomes, products they didn't have access to, in their previous practices or previous practice settings. So I think, and all of those things too are hard. I mean, obviously people do that on their own, but that's also hard. That's hard to be a sole proprietor business owner and take a month vacation, a very tricky, challenging to bring on 15 different products and not burn yourself into a hole as a single proprietor. So it's really inspiring for us to see people hit new thresholds in just the quality of their life, in what they can do for their patients, and then on the financial side as well.
After saying that, Dr. Blake, I'm about to sign up for Portrait. If I can make 3 times as much money and have a month off,
I think I'm gonna put this out there. I think it's okay to say this, and we can with all this flexibility of being able to do your own schedule, have your own brand, have your own location, have patient care support, have your medical malpractice handled, all of this system set for you. The reality is our provider gross comp is better than what I've ever been offered as a dermatologist. So it's and I think I've worked in totally fair, reasonable settings, but we have put such tremendous effort to really deliver an efficient and high quality provider experience. It is it's like, I wish somebody would have offered it to me back in 2014. I would have signed up right away.
And I think that there's an important flip here too, which is we're doing this there's no investment that the provider is making, right? Like Portrait's balance sheet is the one that is signing the lease, buying the product, so that at the end of the day, like every month from day one, they're making money, which is not the reality. I think this marketplace is going to keep evolving, and I think a lot of alternative options will, emerge, but most of them are built around taking a piece of your revenue, but ultimately like the risk of whether you sink float is really on you. Whereas like we are really holding your hand in that from day one. And so I think that was just like philosophically like very important to us. But there's just, there's also just like a lot of education like needs to happen like in this industry. Sometimes these value propositions to like really land. And so I think that's like a really big one to like underscore. It's, it's not just a matter of will I make money? It's like you may actually just like lose money for a very long period of time. And you may not even understand how much money you're going to lose. And based on some of the decisions that you make, some of those might be like long-term arrangements that you're just kind of stuck with. I think you alluded to, what can happen with devices. It can certainly happen with leases, the real estate side. So there's just like there's like a tremendous amount of surface area to trip yourself up on. And so like, I don't know if it's like, it's probably too much detail, but I guess I'll just walk through it because I think it's helpful when you think about what it takes to be like successful in this industry. All right. So if you actually just like wanted to like list it out, like number one, you would have to solve for like your real estate. You'd have to solve for the location of that, how much cost you want to put in there, how, are you going to focus on making it a high-end place, like the design work that goes into that. That's expensive, especially if it's the first time you've ever done it. There's like the actual clinical education piece of it. You have to keep evolving in this space. Are you going to get the attention from the major like drug companies who do a lot of the training? Are you going to get the off-label training? Are you going to be able to make that investment while you're simultaneously making that investment in so many other areas of your practice? Are you going to have the right clinical operations? Are you going to have the right clinical director? Are you doing your clearances correctly? If something were to happen, would you be exposed? There's the actual entity setup, which is very complicated and different depending on the state you're in. If you don't set it up correctly, you run into problems. There's a management of that entity on an ongoing basis, like the license support. There's a communication with your patients. What happens when your patient, is upset with you and you're just trying to figure it out on your own, trying to figure out what to do with like Yelp or Google My Business. And like the list just goes on and on, like, like your inventory management. If you screw that up, you're talking about like tens of thousands of dollars that you can be out of pocket. These products are very expensive. If you lose one, do you have the right insurance coverage? Did you pick the right technology? And so I'm probably being a bit verbose here, but I think the point here is...
I don't think so. I think this is super helpful. Keep going.
The system is not fair for individuals. It's not designed for individuals anymore. Mm-hmm. That's the reality. That's the reason why you're seeing consolidation in many medical verticals and starting to see it aggressively in aesthetics, is because it's not designed for an individual to thrive. And I think if you look fast forward to 10 years, I think a lot of people are going to really, really struggle if they're just trying to operate by themselves. And so, again, I think one of the first points that we talked about earlier here is it's not to the benefit of providers, and it's not to the benefit of patients when that happens.
Praveen, Dr. Blake, this has been a fascinating hour, and I have learned a great deal. I've actually taken away some things that I think can help MRP. But most importantly, I think this is an hour that will be incredibly informative to any clinician operating today or thinking about breaking out on their own or operating in the future. What is the best way for clinicians to reach out to you guys and get connected directly?
So they can go to our page, portraitcare.com, and there's a form that they can just complete, and we follow up pretty quickly for anyone who does that. But get set up with a call. That's probably honestly like the easiest way.
Do these clinicians, when they reach out, get to talk to you guys? Is that how that works?
Yeah, oftentimes. I still recruit some of them myself or have conversations with them. I think I honestly encourage anyone on our team, if they ever want to talk to me or Patrick, like they absolutely should do that, because it's like you're picking a partner and you're going into business with this person. You should feel comfortable with your partner.
Yeah, if you're on a phone too, you can, if it's easier, like the Portrait Providers Instagram handle, or Rob is Portrait Prob, and I'm Patrick Blake MD on Instagram, so that works too.
Got it. Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been an incredible hour, and I appreciate your time very much. Thank you for joining Medtech Marketplace and being partners with MRP. Incredibly grateful for your trust and the opportunity to serve you, and look forward to seeing you guys out in the marketplace.
Thank you so much for having us.